Just ahead on a special American Black Journal, we're dedicating the entire show to diversity in the media. We'll have highlights from the National Association of Black Journalists convention here in Detroit, and we'll talk with attendees about the opportunities for African Americans to tell our story. It's a show you don't want to miss. American Black Journal starts now.
American Black Journal is funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, a partner with communities where children come first.
How does diversity bring energy to us all? At DTE Energy, we believe that it's the contributions of all that build great communities. As a company, we grow stronger by welcoming the unique perspectives of everyone. As community members, we support our state's broad culture and heritage. From working closely with women and minority-owned suppliers to embracing our local cultures, DTE Energy is powering diversity. The DTE Energy Foundation is a proud sponsor of Detroit Public Television. Masco Corporation is proud to manufacture innovative and environmentally friendly products for the home. Delta Faucets, Craft Made in Maryland cabinets, and Behr brand paints have all been designed with you in mind. Masco and its family of companies, serving Michigan communities since 1929.
Welcome to American Black Journal. I'm Stephen Henderson. More than 3,000 journalists, media professionals, and students attended the recent National Association of Black Journalists Convention and Career Fair right here in Detroit. Their jam-packed schedule included workshops, masterclasses, sessions with newsmakers, film screenings, and a Diversity in the D town hall meeting. I had the opportunity to participate on a panel at that forum, which focused on increasing and maintaining diversity in the media. Take a look.
Stephen, you've been in many different aspects of this business: newspaper, radio, TV, you do it all. What's your reflection on where we are now?
So I think the span of my life kind of tells the story of what journalism has gone through post-Kerner. I'm born in 1970 here in Detroit and grew up here. I got my first professional opportunity as an intern at the Detroit Free Press. That internship program doesn't exist anymore. I got my first job with Knight Ridder, the company that owned the Detroit Free Press for many years. I got hired in 1992 into a Knight Ridder paper at the time of a hiring freeze because there was a special set aside for minority candidates, right? They didn't have enough African Americans working there. And so they said, here's somebody we want to give an opportunity, forget about the hiring freeze. That kind of program doesn't exist anymore. And so, you know, there was this push, this real push in especially the mid to late 1980s and early 1990s, where companies really did say, we've got to diversify these newsrooms. We got to give opportunities to people who can help us tell stories more accurately, more deeply about communities that we don't really have represented here. And the contraction in the industry, of course, has chewed through all of those programs. And so an African-American kid today in Detroit who's 18 or 19 years old looking for an internship has very, very few choices about where to look. You want to get a job at a small newspaper. The small newspaper I worked at in Lexington, Kentucky is down to a third of the staff size that it was when I was there. They don't have an internship program. They don't have a program that gets minorities into the newsroom. These things have gone away. And you know, I always say that when we really want to do something in this business or in this country, we do it, right? We don't just talk about it. We don't just say, well, I would like to diversify this newsroom. I would like to hire more women. I would like to hire more minorities. We actually do the things that we prioritize. We actually do the things that we think matter. And I think we've got to get back to a space where the people who run media companies are thinking actively all the time about opportunity and how to create it and how to nurture it. As Marla said, even if you get in the door at a lot of these places now, it's even harder to find the sort of growth track that would lead you to be a senior editor. There's another thing, though, that I think is going on that's really important, and I think it's a positive trend to sort of take out of this. I mean, the diversification of media itself and the splintering of media itself has created opportunity where it didn't exist before, and it's outside of the major newsrooms. So I've become good friends with a couple of guys who run a website called Very Smart Brothers. I don't know if people in the audience know that. I love that site. I love those guys. I have them on the show. I have them on the radio show a lot. They've created their own space, right? They are both people who 20 years ago or 30 years ago, when I was coming out of college, they would have been looking for jobs in newsrooms. They would have been trying to get ultimately to some place like the New York Times or the Washington Post. Neither one of them, I've talked to them about this, neither one of them really has that as a goal. They like that the space that they've created is independent from that. And that space is being sought after by the New York Times. The New York Times wants to buy it. The Washington Post wants to buy it. And they won't sell it because they're like, I don't want to work there. I think we're starting to see with this sort of, again, the splintering of media, the ability of anybody, really, if you want to create a space where your voice can be heard is a tremendous opportunity for minority journalists. And I think as we go forward, that may be where we see far more progress than in the traditional newsrooms, which of course have all kinds of tremendous challenges of their own and will not get back to that era that I came up in.
Karen Samuels, where are we in terms of ownership? Back in 1974, President Gerald Ford stood up and publicly congratulated WGPR for being the first African-American owned television station in the nation. Well, that was 40 some odd years ago. How many African-American owned television stations are there now? And that was a time when affirmative action, many people viewed as something positive, something good. In the backdrop of what we see happening in America now, it's not that way. And if you're going to own something, you've got to figure out how to get it on your own, because a lot of times some of the things that were used as aids to help us get it before aren't the situation now. You look at this from a historical perspective in many respects.
You know, Chuck, excuse me, from a historical perspective, you're right. William Banks was the first African American to be granted a broadcast license ever by the FCC. First time in history in the United States. And that opened up the doors for him to create an environment and a station where some of the things we've been talking about, opportunities came to African Americans to have positions in front of the camera, behind the camera. We were talking a bit about diversity. It was more than just personnel. One of the things that the Kerner Commission report said was, in chapter 15, which is all about the media, was the finding that, and it applied, and they looked at Detroit in particular and all the other cities, that news came from a white perspective. And that was not a perspective of African Americans and understanding of their challenges and issues. William Banks, one of the reasons he wanted a TV station was to provide that perspective, point of view. And so where are we today? Well, technology has had a big impact on African American ownership in internet and cable stations. So we have Oprah Winfrey with OWN, we have other opportunities there. However, when you talk about independent, locally owned stations, there are virtually none. Now, we have African Americans who've bought affiliate stations, network affiliate stations, but that has never really been reproduced in any significant way. And it had a huge impact on people. Someone was here earlier talking about Fox and where are the opportunities for people to get their training and internships in television? Well, there are people in every station just about in this market who got their start at WGPR because the doors were open to people, they had the opportunity, and that doesn't really exist. And so that's a challenge going forward to say, where do you get that experience and opportunity? Because as Stephen said, the landscape of technology and its impact has been shrinking newspapers, has opened up all kind of avenues. People have access to the means of producing their own radio, TV, podcasts, tremendous. But then how do you vet and how do you trust what's being said? So I mean, it's really an amazing landscape now, but that element of ownership has really gone to internet technology, cable technology, which are programs that are seen nationally. Those are national audience. They don't speak to a local audience. That kind of perspective from an independently owned African American network doesn't exist.
The role of people of color has increased rather dramatically in most newsrooms across the country. But don't let the statistics of that fool you, because when you really get into the number of news directors at television stations, and really importantly, general managers at television stations, you really see that while there's growth overall, the growth hasn't occurred nearly at the level of top leadership that it needs to occur at. Now, there's one really interesting statistic, because I thought where we would see the highest number of people of color being general managers or news directors would be in smaller markets, because in some ways maybe it would be, an easier entree in a smaller market, because typically that's the case for many people when they break into the business. But the fact of the matter was, it wasn't in the larger markets. So, for example, as it dealt with general managers, I think the statistic was about 9% of general managers across the country in non-Spanish speaking TV stations, so like affiliates like WDIV, affiliates like WXYZ, about 9% were people of color. And yet when you looked at the top 25 markets, it was 22.5% were people of color. And I started to think about that, and I was thinking, well, how do you account for that? And I began to realize that the top 25 markets tend to have more people of color than sometimes the smaller markets do. And that's not entirely correct every single issue, but also maybe there's a little more management, maybe there's a little more desire to be diverse. So I know the other folks have things to say, but I've had front row seats for 30 years working at all the different stations that Chuck mentioned. In fact, I say I sort of hit for the cycle, as they say in baseball. But the truth of the matter is things have gotten better, but they're nowhere near where they need to be.
I walk into newsrooms now as a union rep. It's a core value of SAG-AFTRA that our strength is in our diversity. We were leading the charge way before Me Too started in Hollywood. I don't have to tell you that back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s, even beyond, the characters of color in the movies were not played by actors of color. Recently, the debate over Scarlett Johansson playing a transgender. So the debate is not over for actors and for journalists. I think it has changed. I mean, a little bit. Today, the people I see and hear on the air, they are almost allowed to sound a little different and look a little different, but I'm really disheartened by the research I see. And I know Marla brought a lot of numbers, but newsrooms have stagnated over the past 10 years when it comes to diversity. News media companies are reluctant to even release the race and gender breakdowns of their staffs to the Women's Media Center, which did a study this year. From Neiman, fewer women and people of color worked at radio stations in 2017 than in 2016. That's going backwards, folks. So that troubles me. And I do think there is more diversity in the working ranks of some newsrooms. The TV and radio stations I now visit in Detroit and Windsor, Minneapolis, Indianapolis, Chicago, are being managed in large part. Marla is the wonderful, enlightened exception here. They are being managed at the upper levels by people who look a lot like the broadcast managers of 1968, frankly. And that's why I think this discussion must not stop. And I think NABJ is doing really important work in this. But that's where I think we are.
We're hearing a common word now. It's called fake news. And I'm wondering whether or not that charge is having an impact on how our industry is perceived and how that might be hurting us in terms of recruitment on trying to get young people into our business because of how we are being portrayed and described in terms of our business. Any thoughts on that?
Let's go back to 1968 and the Kerner Commission. What did the Kerner Commission say, essentially, about American newsrooms? It said that they were getting the story about what was going on in urban America wrong. In other words, that they were perpetrating fake news. You know, like a lot of things in this country, I feel like the majority population sometimes comes late to things and ideas that are pretty prevalent already in the black community. Think of how many times in the African American community over the years we have seen really inaccurate portrayals of what goes on in our community or why it goes on in our community. The whole idea of fake news is kind of a black concept if you sit and think about it, right? The skepticism of the authenticity of news outlets. And Donald Trump has weaponized that on behalf of his own, ideology and his own politics, and that's dangerous in the sense that what he's doing is trying to draw a line between the media and mainstream America and say that the media are telling lies to everybody about everything. But I think we got to be really careful about how we think about this kind of thing, right? There is a lot of fake news about minority communities, and we don't call it that. We just say it's the newspaper, right? Or it's the television, or it's the radio, and as journalists, obviously, as journalists of color, I think there's an extra responsibility to make sure that that doesn't happen, that you speak up and say, hey, this is not the way this ought to be talked about or covered. There's another side of the story. But I think it would be a mistake for us to sit here and say fake news is not something that minority communities are really familiar with. We've been accustomed to that a lot longer than Donald Trump has been around. As American Black Journal celebrates its 50th year on air, we wanted to take the pulse of today's journalists on the current opportunities for African Americans to have a voice in the media. One Detroit's Will Glover talked with some of the media professionals at the NABJ convention, and here's what they had to say.
Obviously, there's definitely not enough diversity in newsrooms, and most people, when they think of diversity in the newsroom, they seem to believe that they seem to equate that to what's in front of the camera. But diversity in the newsroom is not just the person in front of the camera or the reporter on the print side that's out reporting, but photographers, editors. I think there's definitely not enough diversity because it doesn't reflect the population that we live in.
There's always more progress needed as long as there's people and as long as there's a desire to do the work. I feel like there's definitely a need for more of us. The fact that diversity is still a topic tells you that we still need it.
I've seen more inclusion about it over the years. They still have to work on it because we're not thought of right away, or when someone points it out, they're like, oh yeah, we have to go get one. So you still see that a lot. I think you're still seeing negative images regarding the African American community, or really any minority community, but I think you're also starting to see more positive stories as well, but it takes some work to get there because everyone still equates poor with black, poor with crime, poor with everything, when in fact the majority community, they are the far greater ones who are poor. They're the far greater ones who use public assistance. They're the far greater ones in one way or another commit a crime as well, but they're not seen that way. And that needs to be shown in a much more greater light than ever before. But it's coming, it's growing.
In my experience in traditional media, having minorities there doesn't mean anything if they don't have power, if they don't have agency, if their perspective is not listened to. I was a minority, one of only 3 minorities in my last job, and it didn't mean anything when only one of us spoke up, and when we spoke up, or when I spoke up, I was either silenced or ignored, and my perspective wasn't appreciated. I was hired as, I felt almost like I was a token hire, just like so they could say, hey, we've got diversity on our staff, but it doesn't mean anything.
We have more opportunity across the board. We still have a lot to do, and we still have a lot to work toward, but I think that being able to develop our own platforms and also having those established platforms including us and giving us certain opportunities definitely has developed.
There are issues. This is a systematic problem. This industry was created when the country was still segregated. It was in the 60s during the civil rights movements, in the 50s, that these TV stations popped up. They weren't created for Black people. And so our stories have never been told. They've been filtered from the media. For example, they were talking about some of our stories not getting told. Well, in St. Louis, we covered what became the Black Lives Matter movement, a civil rights movement in the city of St. Louis. We didn't have any minority representation on the management staff. So we didn't have anybody making decisions for us on how we covered what we were seeing. Nobody of color. And so the product is skewed.
The hiring and training of Black journalists, along with the increased coverage of racial issues, were among the recommendations of the Kerner Commission in its 1968 report on the causes of the civil disturbances in Detroit and other cities. Here is a report produced by One Detroit's Bill Kubota, looking at the number of minorities on air and behind the scenes right here in Detroit.
After the uprising in Detroit, the Kerner Commission issued a report stating, "The journalistic profession has been shockingly backward in seeking out, hiring, training, and promoting Negroes." The news was a white man's game. The commission found African Americans held just 5% of the editorial positions in news, mostly with Black-owned organizations. In Detroit, the Free Press had 2 Black reporters. The Detroit News had just 1. There weren't many African Americans in media at all.
I remember Martha Jean the Queen, who was on the radio. Remember, that was basically where most of the African Americans were on the radio. They were not on television.
Livonia Perryman would appear on DPTV's Detroit Black Journal and Detroit Black News in the 1970s, part of the first wave of African Americans to come on board after the Kerner Report.
I didn't have a journalism background. I came out of education, and I did tell them, I said, if you train me, I will be one of the best.
20 years later, a panel of reporters joined Detroit Black Journal host Ed Gordon, talking about the state of journalism in Detroit.
What about the thought of not giving coverage, the same amount of coverage to blacks as opposed to whites? You truly believe that that goes on in the city, is that right?
I think the record substantiates that. There isn't the slightest doubt about that. But again, the point is not coverage, but what kind of coverage.
Okay.
And the rule, unfortunately, is the negative about blacks is going to be prominently used.
And displayed.
The positive is frequently ignored.
And I have a definition.
At that time, a National Association of Black Journalists survey found that in the Detroit area, 12.6% doing news were African American, although they made up 22% of the population. Leap ahead 2 more decades, and more strides have been made. But recently, some see efforts sliding back a bit.
I'm afraid that it has fallen behind. There was a period in my career when a premium had been placed on getting color into a newsroom and getting diversity into a newsroom. There was a time when affirmative action was not a bad word.
Even though there are more, say, African Americans present on TV, on all the stations, and that's good. Their influence in the decision-making capacity and being able to determine what stories are covered with the right angle, I dare say that probably has waned.
A recent survey by the American Society of News Editors found African American news decision makers made up 28% at the Free Press and 11% at the Detroit News, while our informal survey found about 1/4 to 1/3 of news decision makers are African American at channels 2, 4, and 7, with just a few in upper management. History professor and Detroiter Keith Dye wants to know, with parts of Detroit on the upswing, who's covering the rest?
So I can understand the enthusiasm about downtown Detroit and Midtown. I'm all for that. But if you're not in a position of power to command the attention that you need, then you will not get the coverage. And so what is the influence on those blacks who are in the media to be able to say, hey, this should be covered?
And we'd like to acknowledge our late colleague and former host of this program, Cliff Russell, who was featured in that report. That's our program for today. Thanks for watching. You can get more information about our guests at AmericanBlackJournal.org. And as always, you can connect with us on Facebook and on Twitter. We'll see you next time.
As American Black Journal looks ahead at the next 50 years, we want to hear from you, the viewers. Tell us what you think of this program and what you'd like to see on future episodes. Visit AmericanBlackJournal.org to take a quick survey and share your opinion. Thank you.
American Black Journal is funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, a partner with communities where children come first.
How does diversity bring energy to us all? At DTE Energy, we believe that it's the contributions of all that build great communities. As a company, we grow stronger by welcoming the unique perspectives of everyone. As community members, we support our state's broad culture and heritage. From working closely with women and minority-owned suppliers to embracing our local cultures, DTE Energy is powering diversity. The DTE Energy Foundation is a proud sponsor of Detroit Public Television. Masco Corporation is proud to manufacture innovative and environmentally friendly products for the home. Delta faucets, craft-made in Merillat cabinets, and Behr brand paints have all been designed with you in mind. Masco and its family of companies, serving Michigan communities since 1929.